Monitors blared a frantic rhythm as the decorated Marine commander violently shoved the medical tray across the room. Plastic exploded against the wall. Oatmeal splattered across sterile white paint. A water cup hit the floor. Nurses jumped. One of them actually flinched. Commander Richard Sterling didn't care. At 62 years old, the retired Marine looked like a man held together by scars, stubbornness, and pure hatred. "Get me a different nurse." His voice thundered through room 714, one who understands sacrifice. Outside the room, 3 nurses exchanged exhausted looks. Inside, the heart monitor screamed steadily beside the bed. The infection eating through Richard Sterling's body was winning, but the commander seemed determined to fight everyone except the actual disease. Then the door opened. Catherine Bennett stepped inside carrying a fresh medication tray, calm, silent, unimpressed. Richard took one look at the navy blue scrubs and immediately sneered. Another civilian. Kat didn't respond. She simply placed the tray beside the bed. "Good morning, Commander. Don't call me that, okay?" The answer caught him off guard. Most people argued. Most people apologized. Most people reacted. This woman didn't. She simply began preparing the IV medication. Richard's anger immediately returned. "You people know nothing about service." The nurse continued working. Nothing about sacrifice, still nothing. Nothing about watching good men die. Finally, Catherine Bennett looked up. And for the first time, something dangerous appeared behind her calm green eyes. Something dangerous appeared behind Catherine Bennett's calm green eyes. Not anger, not fear, recognition. The kind that arrives when somebody unknowingly steps on a landmine buried years ago. Commander Richard Sterling didn't notice it. Not yet. His fever was too high, his pain was too intense, his pride was too loud. The retired Marine sat upright in the hospital bed like he was still briefing troops before a combat patrol. Sweat soaked the collar of his gown. The infection eating through his femur had driven his temperature dangerously high, but somehow he remained focused on fighting the nurses instead of the disease trying to kill him. "Did you hear me?" Richard growled. Kat continued preparing the IV line with slow, deliberate movements. "I heard you." "Then answer me." "I don't think you actually want an answer." That caught him off guard. His pale blue eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." Kat checked the medication tubing and adjusted the drip chamber without looking rushed or intimidated. "You're angry." Richard laughed harshly. "No kidding." "No," she replied calmly. "The infection is making you angry. The pain is making you angry. The loss of control is making you angry." For the first time since she'd entered the room, Richard didn't have an immediate response. "You think yelling at nurses will fix any of that?" His jaw tightened because the worst thing in the world wasn't being challenged, it was being understood, especially when you didn't want to be. Richard pointed toward the door. "Get out." Kat didn't move. "I want another nurse." She remained exactly where she was, a military nurse. Someone who actually understands what sacrifice costs. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm beside the bed. Richard's breathing grew heavier. Every word was costing him energy he couldn't afford to waste. Yet he kept going, because some men would rather die fighting than admit they were losing. "You people work 12-hour shifts and think you're heroes," he said bitterly. "You complain about paperwork, bad coffee, being tired." His eyes hardened. "I buried 25 Marines." The room became very quiet. Kat stopped adjusting the IV line. Richard didn't notice. "I wrote letters to mothers," he continued. "I folded flags. I carried kids who weren't old enough to shave." His voice cracked slightly, just enough. "You don't know what sacrifice is." The words hung heavily in the air. Kat stared at him, not offended, not angry, just staring. Then she slowly removed her gloves and placed them on the tray beside the bed. Richard frowned. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the door and turned the lock. The click echoed through the room. Immediately, Richard's military instincts activated. His eyes narrowed. The atmosphere changed. "What the hell are you doing?" Kat crossed the room and closed the blinds. Sunlight disappeared. The room grew dimmer. The hallway vanished from view. Now it was just the two of them, Commander Sterling and the nurse. Richard's pulse accelerated, not from fear, from confusion. Nothing about this interaction made sense anymore. Kat returned to the foot of the bed and removed her hospital identification badge. She placed it beside the gloves and looked at him for several seconds before speaking. "You talk a lot about sacrifice, Commander." Her voice had changed. The softness was gone, something older had replaced it, something heavier. "You talk about Marines, you talk about young men who never came home, you talk about Sangan." Richard froze. The name hit him like a punch. His fevered mind suddenly sharpened. "How do you know that name?" Kat didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the sleeve of her scrub top and slowly rolled it upward. Richard watched in silence. The fabric moved past her elbow, revealing faded ink on the inside of her forearm. The moment he saw it, the color drained from his face. Fleet Marine Force. His heart skipped a beat. Civilian nurses didn't wear that insignia. Civilian nurses didn't know Sangan. Civilian nurses didn't lock doors before difficult conversations, and they definitely didn't carry themselves like Catherine Bennett. Richard stared at the tattoo, then at her face, then back at the tattoo. His mind desperately trying to process what he was seeing. Impossible, absolutely impossible. Finally, Kat broke the silence. "Do you remember Danny Miller?" Richard's breath caught instantly. The room seemed to shrink around him, because Danny Miller wasn't a name found in newspapers. He wasn't a famous Marine. He wasn't someone civilians talked about. Danny Miller was one of his dead Marines, one of the boys he never stopped thinking about, one of the names he still saw at 3 o'clock in the morning when sleep refused to come, and only someone who had been there. Only someone who had stood in the dust and blood beside them would know how much that name still hurt. Richard stared at Catherine Bennett as if the room had suddenly tilted sideways. Danny Miller. Out of all the names she could have spoken, she chose that one. Not Rodriguez, not Hansen, not Pierce. Danny Miller, the youngest Marine in the platoon, the kid who carried photographs of his girlfriend folded inside his helmet cover, the kid who couldn't grow a proper beard no matter how hard he tried. The kid Richard had personally written a condolence letter for 14 years earlier. His throat tightened. "Who are you?" For the first time since entering the room, Catherine didn't immediately answer. Instead, she pulled a chair away from the wall and sat down across from his bed, calmly, comfortably. Like somebody preparing for a conversation years overdue, Richard watched every movement, the way she sat, the way she held eye contact, the way she carried herself. The pieces were starting to fit together, and he didn't like the picture they were creating. "You weren't a nurse then." The statement came out rough, more accusation than question. Kat nodded once. "No." Richard felt his pulse quicken. "Then who were you?" A long silence followed. Outside the room, hospital life continued normally. Monitors beeped. Phones rang. Orderlies pushed carts down hallways. Yet inside room 714, it felt as though the entire world had stopped moving. Finally, Catherine spoke. "I was 20 years old." Her voice carried none of the emotion he expected. No drama, no bitterness, just facts. "I thought I knew everything." A faint smile touched her lips. "I was wrong." Richard said nothing. He wanted answers. Instinct told him not to interrupt. "So I joined the Navy." Another pause, then they attached me to Marines. The room became very still. Richard already knew where this was going. He simply didn't want to believe it. Kat leaned back slightly. "The first week I met your battalion, somebody told me Marines were basically oversized children carrying rifles." A small laugh escaped her. "The second week somebody got shot." The smile disappeared. "After that, I stopped listening to stereotypes." Richard stared at her. Every word felt familiar, not because he'd heard it before, because only someone who had lived it could say it that way. Only someone who had been there understood how quickly jokes disappeared after the first casualty. "You were a corpsman." Kat nodded. The confirmation landed harder than expected. Richard looked away briefly, toward the window, toward the closed blinds, toward anything except her face, because suddenly a dozen forgotten memories were clawing their way back to the surface. Dust, heat, explosions, the smell of gun oil, the sound of helicopters, young Marines laughing before patrol. Young Marines not returning afterward. His chest tightened. "You were with us." It wasn't a question anymore. Kat nodded again. "I was." The old Marine closed his eyes, trying to remember, trying to place her, trying to find the young corpsman inside the woman sitting across from him. The problem was that memory plays cruel tricks. 14 years changes people, war changes people, time changes people, and corpsemen were often the last people Marines truly looked at, not because they didn't matter, because they mattered too much. Marines noticed corpsemen when they were hurt, when they were bleeding, when they were scared, when they were dying. Those memories rarely came attached to clear faces. They came attached to moments. Richard slowly opened his eyes. "What's your nickname?" The question escaped before he realized he was asking it. Every corpsman had one, every single one. Kat smiled for the first time, a genuine smile, small, almost sad. "You remember that?" Richard laughed weakly. "Nobody remembers real names." The smile widened slightly. "Kat." Silence. The name struck him immediately, not like lightning, like a distant explosion, something far away suddenly becoming visible. Kat. He knew that name. He absolutely knew that name. His breathing slowed, then stopped, just for a second, because fragments of memory were beginning to connect. A helicopter landing in a dust storm, a young corpsman covered in somebody else's blood, a Marine screaming for help, a voice shouting orders. Kat, his eyes widened, slowly, dangerously. And for the first time since she entered the room, Richard Sterling looked genuinely shaken, because he was starting to remember exactly who Catherine Bennett used to be, because he was starting to remember, not clearly, not all at once. Memory doesn't work that way, especially combat memories. They arrive in fragments, a smell, a voice, a sound, a moment frozen in time. Richard stared at Catherine Bennett and suddenly found himself back in Afghanistan. The year was 2010. The heat was unbearable. The air smelled like dust, diesel fuel, and burned metal. Young Marines filled the combat outpost. Most of them were barely old enough to buy a beer. All of them acted invincible. None of them were, and somewhere among them had been a tiny Navy corpsman everyone called Kat. Richard's heartbeat accelerated. "Oh my God!" The words escaped before he could stop them. Kat said nothing. She simply watched him remember, watched him struggle through 14 years of buried memories. Then he saw it, not a complete memory, a snapshot. A young corpsman sprinting across an open road while rounds cracked overhead. A Marine bleeding out beside a wall, somebody screaming for a medic, everybody else taking cover, and Kat running toward the gunfire instead of away from it. Richard looked at her, then looked again, trying to reconcile the image in his head with the woman sitting across from him. "No," his voice sounded distant, almost disbelieving. "No way." Kat smiled faintly, not because she enjoyed his reaction, because she'd seen it before. Veterans always reacted the same way when enough time passed. People remembered the actions, the moments, the stories. They rarely remembered the faces, especially the faces of those who survived. Richard leaned forward, ignoring the pain in his leg, ignoring the IV line, ignoring everything except her. "You were at Checkpoint Raven." It wasn't a question. The memory had finally surfaced. Kat nodded. Richard felt a chill run through him. Checkpoint Raven, the worst day of his deployment, the day everything changed. The day Danny Miller died. The room suddenly felt smaller. The oxygen felt thinner because he remembered more now, a lot more. He remembered chaos, explosions, dust clouds, radio traffic, Marines screaming casualty reports. Then he remembered Kat, covered in blood, moving from one wounded Marine to another, never stopping, never slowing, never looking scared. Richard swallowed hard. "You were there." The words barely escaped his throat. Kat's expression softened. "Just slightly, I was." Richard looked away because the next memory hurt. The next memory always hurt. Danny, young, laughing, alive, then not. The image slammed into him with brutal force. 14 years vanished. The hospital vanished. The present vanished. Suddenly he was kneeling beside a dying Marine again, trying to keep pressure on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, trying to say the right things, trying to save someone he couldn't save. His breathing became uneven. Kat noticed immediately. Old habits, old training, some things never leave. "Come on, Commander." Her voice remained calm, steady, grounding. "Take a breath." Richard looked at her. Anger was gone now, completely gone. What remained was something far more dangerous. Guilt, pure guilt. The kind that survives for decades, the kind that grows in silence. The kind veterans carry long after everyone else believes they've healed. "You remember him?" The question sounded stupid the moment it left his mouth. Of course she remembered him. Kat looked toward the floor for a moment, then back at him. Every one of them. The answer hit harder than Richard expected, because that was the secret nobody talked about. People assumed combat medics remembered the survivors. They didn't, not mostly. They remembered the ones they lost, the faces that stayed, the names that never disappeared, the people who followed them home. Richard looked down at his hands, old hands now, scarred hands, shaking hands. I should have gotten him out sooner. Kat immediately shook her head. No, I should have, no. His voice grew stronger, more desperate. I was in command, and he was a Marine. Silence. Richard stared. Kat held his gaze. He volunteered. Another silence. He chose that patrol. Richard looked away because he hated that she was right. He hated it because he'd spent 14 years building an entire identity around blaming himself, and now somebody who had actually been there was challenging that belief. The old Marine laughed bitterly. You make it sound simple. Kat's smile carried no humor. It's not simple. A pause. It's just true. The room became quiet again. For the first time since she entered, neither of them seemed interested in arguing. Outside, nurses continued working. Visitors moved through hallways. Life went on. Inside room 714, two veterans sat across from one another with 14 years of unfinished conversation between them. Richard finally looked up, really looked at her, not as a nurse, not as hospital staff, not as a civilian, as one of them, as someone who understood. As someone who had stood in the same dust and carried the same ghosts. And for the first time since arriving at the VA hospital, Commander Richard Sterling felt completely and utterly exhausted, not physically, emotionally. Because the walls he'd spent 14 years building around his guilt were beginning to crack, and Catherine Bennett had only been in the room for 20 minutes. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy. The kind of silence that only exists between people who have seen the same terrible things and survived them differently. Richard stared at the hospital blanket covering his legs. The blanket looked ordinary, soft, white, forgettable, yet somehow it felt absurd. Because 14 years ago he had been responsible for nearly 800 Marines in a combat zone, now he struggled to get out of bed without assistance. Life had a cruel sense of humor. You know what's funny? His voice sounded rough. Kat leaned back in her chair. No. A faint smile touched Richard's lips. Neither do I. The smile disappeared as quickly as it arrived. I spent 14 years convincing myself I failed them. Kat remained quiet, listening, waiting, the way experienced medical professionals do, the way experienced veterans do. Richard rubbed his forehead. I thought if I carried it long enough, maybe I'd earn the right to forgive myself. The admission seemed to surprise even him, because he wasn't a man who talked about feelings. He was a Marine. His generation didn't discuss trauma. They buried it, ignored it, worked through it. Drank through it, anything except talk about it. Yet somehow he was saying things he'd never told another human being, and he hated how easy it felt. Kat understood why, because she'd seen it before, hundreds of times. Veterans often spent years refusing to talk. Then one day they met somebody who understood, and suddenly the dam broke. Richard stared toward the closed blinds. I still remember every name. A pause, every single one. Another, Danny, his jaw tightened. Rodriguez, a breath. Hall, another. Peterson. The names continued. One after another, not rushed, not dramatic, just remembered. Kat listened without interrupting, because every veteran carried a list, everyone, different names, same weight. Richard finally stopped. The room felt quieter afterward, almost emptier, like speaking the names aloud had changed something, even slightly. Then he looked at her. What about you? Kat knew exactly what he meant. The question wasn't about deployments, or military service, or medals. It was about ghosts, the ones that stayed, the ones that followed you home. The ones that appeared at 3 in the morning when the world became quiet enough to hear them. She looked down briefly, then nodded. I remember mine too. Richard wasn't surprised, not even a little, because people like them always remembered. The public imagined veterans forgot over time. Reality worked differently. The details faded, the feelings didn't. I used to think remembering was the punishment. Kat's voice was calm, measured. I thought carrying them meant I was honoring them. Richard listened carefully because something about her tone told him she was leading somewhere important. Then she smiled sadly. "A therapist finally asked me a question." Richard raised an eyebrow. "What question?" Kat looked directly at him. "She asked whether the people I lost would have wanted me to spend the rest of my life miserable." The room became silent. Richard immediately looked away because he already knew the answer, and he didn't like it, not one bit. Kat saw it happen, saw the realization, the resistance, the discomfort. Veterans hated that question because it exposed something painful. Most survivors' guilt wasn't really about honoring the dead. It was about punishing the living. Richard laughed bitterly. "That's not fair." "No," Kat nodded. "It isn't." A pause, "but neither is war." Richard stared at the ceiling, thinking, really thinking, maybe for the first time in years. Then he sighed, long, slow, tired. "I hated this hospital." The confession seemed random until he continued. "I hated the nurses." Another pause. "The doctors." Another. "The volunteers." Kat smiled faintly. "I noticed." That earned the first genuine laugh she'd heard from him, a short one, rough around the edges. "But real." The sound surprised both of them. Richard shook his head. "You know why?" Kat waited, because now he needed to say it himself. "I thought they didn't understand." Silence. "I thought nobody understood." Another silence, then he looked at her. And for the first time all day, there was no anger in his eyes, only sadness, only honesty, only exhaustion. "I didn't realize I was making them pay for that." Kat nodded slowly, because now they were finally talking about the real problem, not the infection, not the antibiotics. Not the hospital, the loneliness, the isolation, the belief that nobody could possibly understand what he'd been through. It was one of the oldest wounds veterans carried, and one of the hardest to heal. A knock interrupted the moment. Both turned. The door opened slightly. Dr. Harrison peeked inside. Then froze immediately. The physician blinked several times, confused, very confused, because this was not the room he'd left earlier. Earlier there had been shouting, threats, flying food trays. Now the commander and the nurse were sitting calmly having a conversation. The transformation made absolutely no sense. "What happened in here?" Richard looked at Kat. Kat looked at Richard. Then, for the first time all day, both of them smiled. Not because the question had an answer, because it didn't. Not one Dr. Harrison would understand, not without 14 years of history, not without Afghanistan. Not without Danny Miller, not without all the ghosts sitting silently in the room beside them. Richard finally looked toward the doctor, his voice calm now, almost gentle. "Nothing." Then he glanced toward Kat, a small smile still lingering. "Just met an old friend." And outside the room, completely unaware that anything important had happened, the hospital continued moving through another ordinary day. Inside room 714, however, something extraordinary had begun. For the first time in 14 years, Commander Richard Sterling had stopped fighting everyone around him. And for the first time in 14 years, he was beginning to consider the possibility that forgiveness might not be betrayal after all. The change didn't happen overnight. Healing never does. Hollywood loved dramatic transformations. One conversation, one breakthrough, one emotional speech, and suddenly the broken person becomes whole again. Real life was uglier than that. Real life moved slowly, painfully, one small decision at a time. The next morning, Commander Richard Sterling was still difficult, not impossible, just difficult. There was a difference. He complained about breakfast, complained about the television, complained about the temperature in his room. Complained about the antibiotics. The nurses noticed immediately, because for the first time he wasn't trying to hurt anybody, he was just being cranky, which compared to throwing food trays represented significant progress. The entire ward celebrated accordingly. Brenda actually brought donuts. Nobody told Richard that. Some victories didn't need announcements. Kat arrived for her shift just after 7, coffee in one hand, patient charts in the other. The moment she stepped onto Ward 7C, she noticed people watching her, not subtly, openly, curiously. Brenda spotted her first, then immediately abandoned the nurse's station. "Okay." Kat sighed, already knowing. "What?" Brenda folded her arms. "You have exactly 10 seconds. Kat continued walking. 10 seconds for what? The explanation. "No, Catherine, no." The older nurse kept pace beside her. "That man made 3 nurses cry." Kat nodded. "I know, he threatened a physical therapist." Another nod. I heard. He called Dr. Harrison a tactical liability. Kat almost laughed. That one sounded exactly like Richard. Brenda pointed dramatically toward room 714. Then you spend 20 minutes alone with him and suddenly he's acting like a civilized human being. Kat opened a patient chart, avoiding eye contact. Maybe he likes me. Brenda stopped walking, stared, then laughed. That's the worst lie I've ever heard. Kat smiled. Because it probably was. The truth sounded far crazier. The truth involved Afghanistan, combat patrols, explosions, dead Marines, and a conversation 14 years overdue. Nobody wanted that explanation before morning coffee. Inside room 714, Richard was awake, not just awake, waiting. Kat noticed immediately. Veterans recognized each other. And one thing veterans were terrible at hiding was anticipation. The old Marine tried pretending he wasn't looking toward the door every few minutes. He failed miserably. Kat entered carrying medications. Richard looked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke for a second. Then, "You're late." Kat checked her watch. 7:03 exactly. She rolled her eyes. There he is. Richard frowned. There who is? The Marine I remember. Silence. Then, despite himself, Richard smiled, very slightly, but enough. The interaction confused everyone, especially the younger nurses. They'd spent months seeing Richard as the angry old patient in room 714. Now they kept catching him smiling. Not often, not dramatically, just enough to make them wonder if they'd imagined the previous version. Kat began checking his IV line, professional, efficient, the same as always. Richard watched quietly. Then finally asked the question he'd been thinking about all night. "Why didn't I remember you?" Kat didn't look up. Most people didn't. "No." His voice grew firmer. "I should've." The answer came immediately. "No, you shouldn't have." Richard frowned. Kat adjusted the IV pump. Then sat down because she already knew where this conversation was heading. "You remember moments." A pause. "You remember casualties." Another. "You remember firefights." Richard listened. "You remember the worst day of your deployment." She folded her arms. Most commanders don't remember the corpsman standing 20 feet away. The truth hurt because it was true, not cruel, not insulting, simply true. Richard stared toward the window, thinking. The uncomfortable reality was that she was right. He remembered battles, decisions, deaths. He remembered radio calls, helicopter evacuations, maps. Briefings, but individual faces, not always, especially support personnel, especially the people who quietly saved lives while everyone else received the attention. "I remember your hands." The statement surprised even him. Kat blinked. "What?" Richard looked embarrassed, actually embarrassed, which was a rare sight. "I remember your hands." The pause. "That's weird." Kat laughed, a genuine laugh. The sound caught both of them off guard. Richard shrugged awkwardly. "Every memory I have of you." He stopped, trying to find the words. "You're doing something." Kat waited. "You were bandaging someone." A pause. "Carrying equipment." Another. "Holding pressure on wounds." He shook his head. "I don't remember your face." Silence. "But I remember your hands." For some reason that hit harder than she expected, much harder, because it felt honest, painfully honest. The kind of memory soldiers actually carried, not perfect movie memories, fragments, pieces, impressions. The conversation ended when physical therapy arrived. A young therapist named Emily entered carrying a clipboard, then immediately froze because Richard Sterling was smiling at a nurse. Voluntarily, the event seemed statistically impossible. Emily looked between them suspiciously. "What happened?" Neither answered, which only made her more suspicious. Richard pointed toward the walker beside his bed. "Let's get this over with." Emily blinked. 3 weeks, 3 entire weeks. The commander had refused physical therapy every single day. Now he was volunteering. "What?" Richard sighed, the sigh of a man already regretting his decision. "I'm doing the therapy." Silence. Emily stared. Kat stared. Even Richard looked surprised he'd said it out loud. Then the old Marine pointed directly at Kat. "This isn't because of her." Nobody believed him. Not even slightly. The first attempt lasted 17 seconds. Richard stood, took 2 steps, nearly collapsed. The pain hit immediately, white-hot, brutal. His leg trembled violently. Sweat appeared across his forehead. His breathing grew ragged. The room became quiet, because moments like these stripped away pride, stripped away rank, stripped away reputation. What remained was vulnerability, pure vulnerability, and veterans hated vulnerability. Richard gripped the walker harder. His knuckles turned white. For a moment Kat thought he might quit. The old version would have quit. The angry version, the hopeless version. The version convinced recovery wasn't worth the effort. Instead, he took another step, then another, only 5 feet. 5 miserable feet, but 5 feet farther than yesterday, 5 feet farther than last week, 5 feet farther than anyone expected. When he finally sat down again, he looked exhausted, completely exhausted, as though he'd run a marathon. Emily looked impressed, Kat looked proud, neither said it, neither needed to. Richard noticed anyway. The old Marine leaned back against his pillow, breathing heavily, then shook his head. "You know what I hate?" Kat smiled. "Only one thing." Richard ignored her. "I hate that recovery feels harder than combat." The room became silent because everybody understood exactly what he meant, and nobody had a good answer. Not really. Kat looked toward him, then quietly said the only thing she knew was true. "That's because combat taught you how to survive." A pause. "Recovery teaches you how to live." The words lingered in the room long after she finished speaking, and judging by the expression on Richard Sterling's face, they hit a target neither of them had expected. The words stayed with Richard long after Kat left the room. "That's because combat taught you how to survive. Recovery teaches you how to live." At first, he hated the statement, not because it was wrong, because it was right, and the truth had an annoying habit of sticking around. For the rest of the afternoon, he found himself replaying it over and over, while staring at the television, while pretending to read, while ignoring the lunch tray sitting untouched beside his bed. Recovery teaches you how to live. The phrase bothered him deeply because surviving had always made sense. Living was harder. Living meant moving forward. Living meant accepting things. Living meant letting go. And Richard Sterling wasn't particularly good at any of those things. The next few days settled into a routine. Hospital routines were strange things. Meals appeared at the same time every day. Medication arrived with military precision. Doctors conducted rounds. Physical therapists inflicted suffering disguised as treatment. Life became predictable, and predictability created space. Space for thinking. Unfortunately, Richard had a lot to think about. Kat became a regular presence in his room, not because she was assigned there permanently. Because she kept finding reasons to stop by, checking medications, reviewing charts, monitoring progress. At least that was her official explanation. The truth was simpler. She recognized something in Richard, something she'd seen before, a veteran standing on the edge of healing and retreating at the same time. Those patients needed attention, not medical attention, and human attention was often harder. One afternoon, she entered carrying a clipboard and found Richard staring at an old photograph. The image looked worn, folded, handled thousands of times. The corners were frayed, the colors faded. The sort of picture people carried because they couldn't bear to lose it. Kat immediately recognized military photographs. Veterans all carried them, different faces, different names, same purpose. Richard noticed her looking. Without speaking, he handed over the picture. Kat accepted it carefully, like something fragile. The image showed a group of Marines standing beside armored vehicles. Young, sunburned, smiling. The kind of smiles only 20-year-olds possessed. The kind that believed bad things happened to other people. Kat's eyes slowly moved across the photograph, then stopped. Immediately, Danny Miller, she recognized him at once. Not because of the face, because of the smile. Danny had smiled constantly. The kid treated combat deployments like summer camp. Nobody ever figured out why. Richard watched her expression. "You found him?" Kat nodded. "Yeah." Silence filled the room, the comfortable kind. The kind shared by people looking at the same memory. "He was 21. Richard's voice sounded distant, as though he were speaking from another country, another life. "He wanted to become a teacher." Kat smiled sadly. "I remember." Richard looked surprised. "He talked about it constantly." A pause. "He talked about baseball too." Another, "and his girlfriend." The old Marine laughed quietly, a genuine laugh, the first real one she'd heard. "Good Lord." He shook his head. "That kid never stopped talking." The memory warmed the room, briefly, just briefly. Because good memories often carried shadows. Richard looked back at the photograph, then toward the window, then back again. "I stopped looking at these." Kat waited. After retirement, his voice grew quieter. I packed everything away. A pause, pictures, another, letters, another, deployment journals. Silence. Why? The question came gently, without pressure, without judgment. Richard stared at the photograph. A long time passed before he answered. Because it hurt. The honesty surprised both of them. Kat nodded slowly, understanding immediately because she'd done exactly the same thing. Boxes in closets, old uniforms. Deployment patches, photographs hidden away where they couldn't ambush you unexpectedly. Veterans pretended those boxes didn't exist, then spent years thinking about them anyway. You know what my therapist told me? Richard groaned. Oh no, Kat laughed. The reaction was immediate. Why does everyone hate therapists? Because they ask questions. Another smile. Fair. Richard pointed toward her. That's exactly the problem. The laughter faded, but the lighter mood remained. My therapist told me something once. Kat settled into the chair, remembering. She said grief isn't something you get over. Richard listened. She said it's something you learn to carry. The room became quiet. Richard looked down at the photograph again. The faces, the smiles, the people who never got older. That's a terrible metaphor. Kat laughed. No, a pause. It's an annoying metaphor. The old Marine considered it, then reluctantly nodded. Yeah, a pause. That's worse. The conversation drifted after that, away from war, away from loss, away from guilt, toward ordinary things, unexpected things. Richard learned Kat had a golden retriever named Murphy. A dog so unintelligent he once got stuck inside a laundry basket. Twice, in the same week, Kat learned Richard secretly loved old Western movies, not ironically, not nostalgically, genuinely, which she found hilarious. John Wayne isn't realistic. Richard looked offended, deeply offended. Watch your mouth. Kat laughed so hard she nearly dropped her clipboard. For the first time in years, room 714 began sounding less like a hospital room, and more like a place where people actually lived. The staff noticed. Everyone noticed. Brenda noticed first, because Brenda noticed everything. One morning, she watched Richard thank a nurse for bringing coffee, actually thank her. The nurse nearly dropped the coffee. By lunch, half the ward knew. By dinner, the entire floor knew. Commander Sterling was being polite. The rumor spread through the hospital with astonishing speed. Doctors heard about it. Therapists heard about it. Administrators heard about it. One nurse claimed it qualified as a documented medical miracle. Richard found out 3 days later. The old Marine sat staring at Kat in complete disbelief. They're talking about me. Kat tried very hard not to laugh, failed immediately. They think you're recovering. Richard looked horrified. That's ridiculous. Kat smiled. Maybe. A pause, or maybe they're right. The answer lingered, long after the conversation ended, long after the medications were given, long after evenings settled over the VA hospital. Because deep down, in a place he rarely allowed himself to visit, Richard Sterling was beginning to suspect something dangerous. For the first time in 14 years, he wanted a future, and that realization frightened him far more than any battlefield ever had. Wanting a future turned out to be a surprisingly uncomfortable experience. Richard Sterling discovered that over the next 2 weeks. For 14 years, his life had operated according to a simple system. Wake up, remember the dead, blame yourself, repeat. The routine was miserable, but it was familiar. And human beings will tolerate astonishing amounts of pain if the pain feels familiar enough. Hope was different. Hope required effort. Hope required risk. Hope demanded that you believe tomorrow might be better than today. For a man who had spent 14 years expecting disappointment, that felt almost reckless. The infection slowly began retreating. The antibiotics were finally winning. His fever disappeared. The swelling decreased. The pain remained, but it no longer controlled every waking moment. Physical therapy sessions grew longer. The walker became less necessary. Small victories started appearing, the kind nobody else noticed, standing without assistance. Walking an extra 10 feet, sleeping through the night, tiny things, important things, the foundations of a life. One afternoon, Kat entered room 714 carrying a tablet. Richard immediately frowned. I don't like that look. Kat smiled. What look? The paperwork look. She sat down across from him. This isn't paperwork. Richard narrowed his eyes suspiciously. Then why are you smiling? The question made her laugh. Because you're becoming paranoid. No, he pointed at the tablet. I'm becoming experienced. Cat opened the screen. Good, a pause. Then this should be easy. Richard immediately hated where the conversation was heading. Experience had taught him that nurses only described things as easy moments before proving the exact opposite. What is it? Cat turned the tablet toward him. The screen displayed a calendar, a very specific calendar. One he recognized instantly, the annual Veterans Community event. Richard groaned, immediately, loudly, dramatically. Oh no, Cat looked pleased, far too pleased. That's not a normal reaction. It is for me. She folded her arms. You're attending. Richard laughed, actually laughed. As if she'd suggested he wrestle an alligator. Absolutely not. Why? Because people are there. Cat nodded. Generally how community events work. The old Marine pointed toward the screen. Those people ask questions. Another point. They tell stories. Another. They want conversations. Cat smiled. You're describing human interaction. Richard looked horrified. Exactly. The nurse tried not to laugh, failed. Again, over the last 2 weeks she'd discovered something surprising. Commander Richard Sterling wasn't difficult because he disliked people. He was difficult because he cared too much. The old Marine had spent years convincing himself isolation was strength. Now every social situation felt unfamiliar, like using muscles that hadn't worked in a decade. You need to leave this room eventually. Richard looked around. This room likes me. No, Cat shook her head. You like hiding? The smile disappeared from his face because that statement landed closer to the truth than he wanted. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. Finally Richard sighed, the long defeated sigh she was beginning to recognize. I hate when you're right, Cat nodded. Everybody does. That earned another laugh. The sound still surprised him, every time, because laughter felt strange now, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar, like reconnecting with an old friend you hadn't spoken to in years. The event happened 4 days later. Richard spent all 4 days trying to find excuses not to attend. Every excuse failed, mostly because Cat had already anticipated them. The weather excuse failed, transportation excuse failed, medical excuse failed, energy level excuse failed. By the end of day 3, he strongly suspected she had planned the entire operation like a military campaign. On the morning of the event, Brenda appeared carrying civilian clothing. Richard immediately knew he was losing. No. Brenda placed the clothes on the bed. Yes. No. Yes. No, the nurse smiled. This is my favorite part. An hour later, Richard found himself standing outside the hospital wearing civilian clothes for the first time in weeks. The experience felt strangely significant, like crossing an invisible line, like leaving safety, like beginning something. The event occupied a large community center 15 minutes from the hospital. Veterans filled the building. Hundreds of them, different ages, different branches, different wars, different stories, yet somehow they all recognized one another instantly. Veterans always did. Richard stepped through the entrance and immediately felt overwhelmed. Conversations everywhere. Laughter. Displays, photographs, memorial tables, service organizations, family members, children running around, life everywhere. He almost turned around. Actually almost turned around. Then Cat appeared beside him. You okay? The question came quietly, without pressure, without judgment. Richard looked across the crowded room, his chest tightening unexpectedly. I forgot. What? He watched an elderly Vietnam veteran laughing with a young Marine, a World War veteran speaking with a Navy corpsman, families sharing stories, people remembering, people healing, people living. I forgot what this looked like. Cat didn't answer immediately because she understood exactly what he meant. Isolation changes memory. Eventually people stop remembering community exists. They stop remembering connection exists. They start believing loneliness is normal. Richard slowly exhaled, a long breath, the kind people take before stepping into unfamiliar territory. Then something happened. A young Marine approached, maybe 22 years old, maybe 23, fresh haircut. Straight posture, nervous expression. Sir? Richard looked up, confused. The young Marine swallowed, clearly intimidated. Are you Commander Sterling? The old veteran froze. It had been years since anybody asked that question, years since the title meant anything, years since anyone remembered. Slowly, he nodded. The Marine immediately smiled. My grandfather served under you. Silence. The room seemed to stop. The young Marine reached into his pocket, pulled out an old photograph. worn, folded, treasured. Richard stared, then felt his breath catch, because standing beside a younger version of himself in the photograph was Danny Miller, alive, smiling, laughing, a moment captured forever. The young Marine pointed. "That's my grandfather." Richard couldn't speak, not immediately, because suddenly the past wasn't standing behind him anymore, it was standing directly in front of him, alive through the people left behind, alive through families, alive through memories, alive through generations that continued despite loss. For the first time in 14 years, Richard Sterling looked at Danny Miller's face without feeling crushed by guilt, and standing quietly beside him, Catherine Bennett saw it happen. The exact moment a man finally stopped carrying the dead as a burden and started carrying them as a gift. The photograph stayed in Richard's hands long after the young Marine walked away. He stared at it as though it might disappear if he blinked. The younger version of himself looked unfamiliar now, stronger, straighter, certain. The face belonged to a man who believed responsibility meant carrying every loss forever. The older Richard finally understood how wrong that belief had been. Beside him, Danny Miller grinned at the camera exactly the way he always had. Like the world existed purely for his amusement, like nothing bad could ever happen, like he had all the time in the world. Kat watched the emotions move across Richard's face. The memories, the grief, the affection, something else too, something new, peace, not complete peace, not yet. "Just enough to matter, you okay?" Richard didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph, then he laughed softly. The sound surprised even him. "He'd hate this." Kat smiled. "What?" "He'd hate being the emotional part of the story." The smile widened. Because that sounded exactly right. Danny Miller had been many things. Serious wasn't one of them. Richard looked down at the image again, then shook his head. "You know what I remember most?" Kat waited. The kid couldn't stay clean for more than 5 minutes. A laugh escaped him. Didn't matter where we were. A pause, base, another, patrol, another, briefing. He pointed at the photograph. He was always covered in dirt. Kat immediately started laughing because she remembered perfectly. "Oh my God," Richard looked up. "You remember?" Kat nodded. He somehow got grease on himself during a foot patrol. The old Marine stared, then burst out laughing. A real laugh. The kind that forces tears into your eyes. The kind that arrives unexpectedly. The kind that hurts and heals at the same time. People nearby turned, smiled, then returned to their conversations because veterans understood. Sometimes laughter was grief wearing a different uniform. The rest of the afternoon passed surprisingly quickly. Richard met other veterans, talked to people, shared stories, listened to stories. At first he felt awkward, then uncomfortable, then strangely relaxed. The transition happened so gradually he barely noticed. One conversation became two, two became five, five became an hour, then another. At some point Kat disappeared. Intentionally. She knew when to stay. More importantly, she knew when to leave. This wasn't her moment, it was his. Near sunset, Richard found himself sitting beside an elderly Vietnam veteran named Frank. The two men had never met before, yet within 20 minutes they were discussing military life like old friends, because some experiences translated across generations. Different wars, same burdens. Frank eventually looked toward him. "Who brought you here?" Richard already knew who he meant. "A nurse." Frank laughed. "Of course." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" The old veteran smiled. "It means every veteran thinks they're saving themselves." A pause. "Usually somebody helps." The words lingered. Long after the conversation ended, the drive back to the hospital happened in silence. Comfortable silence. The best kind. Kat sat behind the wheel. Richard stared out the window, watching evening settle across the city. Streetlights flickered on, restaurants filled with customers, families crossed intersections, ordinary life unfolding everywhere. Finally Richard spoke. "Thank you." Kat glanced toward him, surprised, not because of the gratitude, because of how quietly it arrived. "For what?" Richard looked out the window again. "For not giving up." Silence filled the car. Most people would have misunderstood. Kat didn't. He wasn't talking about physical therapy or antibiotics or hospital treatment. He was talking about him, the angry patient, the difficult patient. The man who spent weeks trying to drive everyone away. The man convinced nobody could understand. Kat smiled softly. "I almost did." Richard immediately looked over. "What?" The nurse shrugged. "You were really annoying." The old Marine stared, then started laughing again. By the time they returned to the VA hospital, the atmosphere between them had changed completely. Not nurse and patient, not caregiver and veteran, something else, something simpler. Two people who had survived the same war in different ways. Two people helping each other carry old weight. 3 days later, Richard received news he wasn't expecting. Dr. Harrison entered the room carrying a chart and a smile. Both were concerning. Doctors smiling usually meant paperwork. "What?" The physician sat down. "I have good news." Richard pointed. "Nobody starts a sentence like that unless they're about to ruin my day." Dr. Harrison laughed. "You're being discharged." The room became quiet. Richard blinked once, twice. "What?" The physician smiled. "Your infection is under control." A pause. "Your mobility is improving." Another. "Your blood work looks good." Another. "You get to go home." The words should have felt exciting. Instead, they terrified him. Kat noticed immediately because she recognized that expression. The same expression she'd seen on dozens of veterans over the years. People assume going home is easy. It isn't, not always. Hospitals become predictable, safe, structured. Home means uncertainty. Home means facing the life waiting outside. Home means nobody checks on you every hour. Nobody schedules your medications. Nobody forces you to attend therapy. For some people, home feels lonelier than any hospital room. Richard stared at the floor for the first time in weeks. He looked afraid, and Catherine Bennett knew the hardest part of his recovery hadn't even started yet. The hardest part of his recovery hadn't even started yet. Richard Sterling realized that the moment Dr. Harrison left the room. The discharge paperwork sat on the bedside table. Simple, ordinary, a few signatures, a few instructions, a follow-up schedule, nothing complicated. Yet Richard stared at it the same way a young Marine might stare at deployment orders, because both represented the same thing, stepping into the unknown. The room felt strangely different now, smaller somehow. For weeks he'd complained about the hospital, the food, the noise, the interruptions. Now that he was leaving, he found himself studying every detail. The chair beside the window, the television mounted on the wall, the hallway outside the door, even the IV pole. Familiar things, temporary things, things he'd somehow grown attached to. Kat noticed immediately. Of course she did. She had spent years watching veterans prepare to leave treatment programs. The reaction was common. Nobody talked about it. Nobody admitted it, but she saw it every time. The fear, the hesitation, the uncertainty. The question every patient eventually asked themselves: what happens when nobody is watching anymore? Richard sat silently for several minutes, then finally looked up. "You know something?" Kat leaned against the counter. "What?" The old Marine rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit she hadn't seen before. "I thought getting better would feel different." The honesty surprised both of them. Kat nodded slowly. "Different how?" Richard looked toward the window, searching for an answer. "I don't know." A pause. "Easier." Another. "Cleaner." He shook his head. "I thought one day I'd wake up and suddenly feel fixed." Kat smiled sadly. "Everybody thinks that." The room became quiet. "Does it happen?" The question sounded almost hopeful. Kat's answer came gently. "No." Richard laughed, not because it was funny, because somehow he'd expected that answer. "You spend your whole life adapting." Kat folded her arms. "To childhood." A pause. "To adulthood." Another. "To military service." Another. "To loss." She looked directly at him. "Recovery isn't becoming a new person." Silence. "It's learning how to be yourself again." The words landed harder than expected. Because somewhere over the past few weeks Richard had started imagining recovery as a destination. A finish line. A place you arrived. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was simply another chapter. The thought stayed with him. Later that afternoon, visitors began arriving. Not family, not doctors, not nurses, veterans. Word had spread, apparently. The first was Frank, the Vietnam veteran from the community event. The second was a retired Army sergeant. The third was a former Navy chief. Then another, then another, then another. By evening, room 714 looked less like a hospital room and more like a veterans' reunion. Stories filled the space. Laughter followed. Arguments about military branches broke out immediately. As tradition demanded, Richard sat in the middle of it all, looking slightly overwhelmed. At one point he leaned toward Kat. "Did you arrange this?" Kat looked innocent, far too innocent. "No." Richard narrowed his eyes. "You're lying. I learned from Marines." That answer earned a chorus of laughter from around the room. For the first time in years, Richard found himself surrounded by people who understood. Not because they'd shared the same deployment, not because they'd served together, because they spoke the same language, the language veterans recognize instantly, the language of dark humor, shared sacrifice, and stories that begin with the words, "You won't believe this." As the evening wound down, the visitors slowly departed. One by one, handshakes, jokes, promises to stay in touch. Promises Richard fully intended to ignore, at least according to his complaints. Yet Kat noticed something. Every phone number handed to him disappeared into his pocket, not the trash. Not the bedside drawer, his pocket. Interesting, very interesting. The next morning arrived faster than expected. Discharge day, Richard barely slept, not because of pain, because of thinking. The hospital felt unusually busy. Staff moved through hallways, patients arrived, patients left. Life continued. By 9 o'clock his bags were packed. Such as they were, a few clothes, books, photographs, nothing extraordinary. Then Kat entered. Neither spoke immediately because both understood something. Goodbyes mattered, especially the unexpected ones. Richard looked toward the packed bag, then toward her. "This is the part I hate." Kat smiled. "Leaving?" "No." A pause, the awkward emotional conversation. The nurse laughed. "Fair." Silence settled again, comfortable silence, the kind that no longer required filling. Finally Richard reached into the bedside drawer, pulled something out, then handed it across. Kat frowned. "What is it?" "A photograph." She looked down and immediately froze. Checkpoint Raven. The photograph showed Marines standing in the dust 14 years earlier. Young, exhausted, alive. Near the edge of the frame stood a tiny Navy corpsman carrying a medical pack almost as large as she was. Kat stared. "Oh my God," Richard smiled. "Took me 3 days to find it." She couldn't take her eyes off the image because she didn't have many photographs from that deployment. Most had been lost, others packed away, others intentionally avoided. For a long moment she simply stared, then looked up. "You kept this?" Richard nodded. "I think maybe." He paused, searching for the right words. "I forgot the wrong things." The room became very quiet because that was the truth, the entire truth. For 14 years he'd remembered guilt, remembered failure, remembered loss, and forgotten friendship. Forgotten courage, forgotten the people who survived. Kat carefully held the photograph, almost afraid to damage it. "Thank you." The old Marine nodded, then stood, slowly, painfully, but stood, without assistance, without the walker, without help. The moment carried more weight than either acknowledged. Because a month earlier that would have been impossible, now it wasn't. Richard picked up his bag, looked around the room one final time, then toward Kat. "Guess this is it." The nurse smiled. "No." He frowned. "What?" Kat pointed toward the hallway. "This is just discharge." A pause. "You still owe me coffee." For a second Richard looked confused, then he laughed. A real laugh. The kind that came easier now, the kind that sounded alive, and together they walked out of room 714, not as a patient and nurse. Not as a commander and corpsman, but as two veterans carrying their ghosts a little lighter than before. Neither of them realized it yet, but the most important part of their story wasn't the war, it wasn't the hospital, it wasn't even the healing, it was what happened next. Because for the first time in 14 years, Richard Sterling wasn't going home to wait for life to end. He was finally going home to live. For the first time in 14 years, Richard Sterling wasn't going home to wait for life to end. He was finally going home to live. The problem was that living turned out to be much harder than leaving the hospital. The first day home felt wrong, not bad, wrong. The house was exactly as he remembered. The furniture hadn't moved. The photographs remained on the walls. The kitchen still smelled faintly of old coffee and furniture polish. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow none of it felt familiar anymore. The silence was the worst part. Hospitals were noisy, monitors beeped, people talked, doors opened and closed. Life constantly moved around you. His house sat perfectly still. The quiet felt enormous. By 9 o'clock in the morning, Richard had already checked his phone 6 times. By noon, he was pacing. By 2 o'clock, he was reorganizing kitchen cabinets for reasons he couldn't explain. By 4 o'clock, he was standing in front of a bookshelf pretending to read titles he'd already memorized years earlier. The truth was simple. He was lonely. And after spending years convincing himself he preferred isolation, that realization was deeply irritating. The phone rang shortly after 5. Richard immediately answered. Too quickly, embarrassingly quickly, he hated that. "Hello?" A familiar voice answered. "You're pacing." Richard froze. "What?" Kat sounded far too pleased with herself. "You're pacing." The old Marine stared around the empty living room. "How would you know that?" "Because every veteran does it." A pause. "The first day home is always weird." Richard sat down immediately, mostly because he suddenly felt predictable, and he hated feeling predictable. "I'm not pacing." Kat laughed. "Sure." Silence followed, not awkward silence, the comfortable kind. The kind that develops between people who don't need to constantly fill empty space. Finally, Richard sighed. "It's quiet." The admission escaped before he could stop it. Kat's voice softened. "Yeah, no advice, no lecture, no attempt to fix it, just understanding. Sometimes understanding mattered more." "You know what helped me?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "What?" "Murphy." The old Marine frowned. "The dog." "The dog." Richard looked skeptical. "That's your professional medical advice?" Kat laughed again. "No." A pause. "My professional medical advice costs money." Another pause. "This is free." Despite himself, Richard smiled. The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. Nothing important, everything important. They talked about television shows, bad hospital coffee, physical therapy, Murphy's ongoing war against household furniture, ordinary things, the sort of conversation Richard hadn't realized he missed. After hanging up, he noticed something strange. The house didn't feel quite as empty anymore. The following week brought new challenges: physical therapy appointments, follow-up visits, medication schedules, adult responsibilities, the sort of things nobody enjoys, yet Richard kept showing up, not because he suddenly loved recovery. He didn't. Recovery still hurt. Recovery was still frustrating. Recovery still demanded effort. The difference was that now he had a reason, a future. People rarely appreciate how powerful that can be. 3 weeks later, Richard returned to the VA for a routine appointment. The moment he entered the building, a strange feeling settled over him, nostalgia, which felt ridiculous. Nobody should feel nostalgic about a hospital, yet there it was. The receptionist smiled when she saw him. "Commander," Richard immediately pointed. "Don't encourage that." The receptionist laughed. Too late, word spread. By the time he reached the elevator, 3 nurses had greeted him. By the time he reached Ward 7C, 6 people had stopped to talk. By the time he found the nurses' station, he was beginning to suspect the entire hospital had formed some kind of conspiracy. Then he saw Kat. She stood behind the station reviewing charts. Navy blue scrubs, hair tied back, focused expression, completely unaware he was watching. For a moment, Richard simply stood there, thinking. The first time he'd seen her, he'd thrown a breakfast tray. Now she was one of the most important people in his life. Life really was absurd. Kat looked up, immediately spotted him. "You're early." Richard frowned. "Why does everyone keep saying that?" "Because you're early." He checked his watch, then realized she was right, again, annoyingly. Kat closed the chart. "How's the leg?" "Better." "Physical therapy?" "Still evil." She nodded. "Fair." The conversation might have continued normally. It didn't, because an alarm suddenly sounded down the hallway, sharp, urgent, unmistakable. Every nurse looked up immediately. A crash cart appeared. Staff started moving, fast, purposeful, professional. Richard recognized the atmosphere instantly. The same way veterans recognize danger before anyone says a word. Something was wrong, very wrong. Kat was already moving. The relaxed expression disappeared, the joking disappeared, the easy smile disappeared. In its place appeared something Richard hadn't seen in years. The combat medic, not the nurse, not the civilian, the corpsman. She moved down the hallway at a near run, other nurses following, doctors responding. The entire ward suddenly alive with urgency. Without thinking, Richard followed. Not close enough to interfere, just close enough to see. The emergency centered around room 728. An elderly veteran had collapsed, cardiac arrest. Chaos filled the room, nurses working, doctors shouting orders, equipment moving, monitors screaming, and in the middle of it all stood Catherine Bennett, calm, focused, completely unshaken. Richard watched as she coordinated compressions, managed medications, directed staff, anticipated problems before they happened. The same woman who once sprinted through gunfire to save Marines. The same woman who sat beside hospital beds helping old veterans heal. The same woman who never seemed to realize how extraordinary she actually was. 20 minutes later, the patient's pulse returned. The room collectively exhaled, relief spreading through everyone present. Kat stepped into the hallway afterward, exhausted, sweat on her forehead, breathing hard. Then she noticed Richard watching. What? The old Marine smiled, a genuine smile. Nothing, a pause, just remembering. Kat frowned. Remembering what? Richard looked toward the room where a veteran had just been given another chance at life, then back toward her. The first reason we all trusted you. For a moment, neither spoke, because some things don't need explanation. Some truths are already understood. And standing in the hallway of a VA hospital, surrounded by people she'd spent years helping, Catherine Bennett finally realized something. The war had ended a long time ago, but her mission never had. The war had ended a long time ago, but her mission never had. The realization followed Catherine Bennett home that evening, not because of the cardiac arrest, not because of the successful resuscitation, because of Richard's words, the first reason we all trusted you. She'd heard variations of that sentence before, from Marines, from soldiers, from veterans, from patients, yet somehow hearing it from Richard felt different. Maybe because he'd known her before she became a nurse, before she became Catherine Bennett, RN. Before she'd built an entire life around convincing herself she was someone new. The drive home passed in thoughtful silence. Murphy greeted her at the front door with his usual enthusiasm. The golden retriever charged across the living room at full speed, immediately slid across the hardwood floor, lost traction. Crashed into a chair, then proudly carried a tennis ball over as though the collision had been intentional. Kat stared, the dog stared back. Neither seemed particularly surprised by the situation. You are unbelievably stupid. Murphy wagged his tail. The dog interpreted this as praise, as always. That night she found herself standing in front of a closet she rarely opened. A small closet, an ordinary closet, yet her hand remained on the handle for nearly a minute, because she knew exactly what sat inside. Old deployment boxes, the same boxes she'd avoided for years. The same boxes she'd convinced herself no longer mattered, the same boxes she never quite managed to throw away. Eventually she opened the door, slowly, carefully, as though something inside might bite. Dust covered the top container. The cardboard looked faded, worn, old. She lifted the lid. Immediately the smell hit her. Canvas, paper, time, memory. Inside sat photographs, letters, maps, unit patches, old notebooks, fragments of another life. Kat picked up a photograph, then another, young Marines, combat outposts, dust storms, sunsets, faces, so many faces, some still alive, some not. For years she'd avoided these memories because she believed looking backward prevented people from moving forward. Lately she wasn't so sure. Maybe remembering wasn't the enemy. Maybe getting trapped there was. Her phone rang. The sound startled her. She glanced at the screen, then laughed. Richard. The old Marine had discovered texting recently. Unfortunately, now he called for technical support every time his phone behaved like a phone. Kat answered. What did you break? Richard sounded offended immediately. Why does everybody assume I broke something? Because you called me. Silence. Fair. Kat sat on the floor beside the deployment box, photographs spread around her. What happened? Richard hesitated. Then I accidentally joined Facebook. The room became silent. Kat closed her eyes, slowly, painfully. You accidentally joined Facebook. Yes, how? I don't know. That's not reassuring. The old Marine sounded genuinely concerned. There are people. Kat laughed hard. What kind of people? People from high school. Silence. Richard, yes, that's generally who Facebook is for. The old Marine sighed deeply. I hate technology. The conversation continued for almost an hour, half technology support, half casual conversation. At one point Richard stopped talking abruptly. What? Kat asked. Nothing. Then, did you ever wonder why we survived? The question appeared so suddenly that it took several seconds to process. Kat looked down at the photograph in her hands, a patrol photo. Afghanistan, young faces staring back, some alive, some gone. Every veteran wonders. Richard remained quiet. I used to think there had to be a reason, a pause, some grand purpose, another, some explanation. Kat understood because she'd spent years asking the same question. Why me? Why not them? Why this outcome instead of another? Questions with no satisfying answers. Finally, she spoke. I don't think survival gives us a purpose. Richard listened. I think survival gives us an opportunity. Silence filled the line, an opportunity, not a guarantee, not a destiny, not a debt, an opportunity to help, to heal, to remember, to live. Eventually Richard laughed quietly. That sounds suspiciously like therapist wisdom. Kat smiled, probably. The next morning, she arrived at the VA expecting an ordinary shift. She should have known better. Hospitals had a strange relationship with ordinary days. They rarely existed. The moment she stepped off the elevator, Brenda spotted her, immediately, which was never a good sign. The older nurse power-walked across the station carrying a folder. Oh good, Kat frowned. What happened? Brenda handed over the folder. Guess. The answer sat on the front page. Veteran Outreach Program. Kat's smile vanished instantly. No, Brenda smiled. Yes, no, yes. Kat looked genuinely distressed. Absolutely not. The older nurse pointed toward the conference room. The director wants to see you. That made things worse, much worse, because directors only wanted meetings when they planned to volunteer somebody for extra work, and judging by Brenda's expression, that somebody was Catherine Bennett. 30 minutes later, Kat sat inside the conference room wondering exactly where her life had gone wrong. The hospital director smiled across the table, which was suspicious. Administrators smiling was always suspicious. We've been reviewing patient outcomes. Kat immediately knew she wasn't going to like this. The director continued, particularly among combat veterans. Definitely not going to like this. Your name keeps appearing. Kat sighed. There it was. The problem with helping people was that eventually someone noticed, and when administrators noticed something successful, they inevitably tried turning it into a program. Unfortunately for Catherine Bennett, that was exactly what was about to happen. Unfortunately for Catherine Bennett, that was exactly what was about to happen. She knew it before the director finished speaking. She knew it from the smile. She knew it from the carefully organized presentation folder. Most importantly, she knew it because administrators only became enthusiastic when they discovered a solution to a problem they didn't personally have to solve. The hospital director folded his hands. Catherine, over the last 3 years, you've consistently demonstrated something unusual. Kat immediately disliked the sentence. People never described normal things as unusual. Normal things didn't generate meetings. The director continued. We've reviewed patient satisfaction reports. A pause, recovery outcomes. Another, mental health referrals. Another, long-term follow-up participation. Kat stared at the ceiling. The director interpreted this as interest. It wasn't. Combat veterans respond differently to you. The room became quiet because that part was true. Kat couldn't deny it. Veterans did respond differently, not because she was special, not because she possessed secret knowledge, because she spoke the language. She knew the jokes, the silences, the deflections, the things people said, the things they didn't say. Most importantly, she knew when somebody was lying about being okay. The director slid a document across the table. Kat didn't touch it. That should have been a warning sign. Nobody paid attention. We want to create a new outreach program. Silence. No. The answer arrived instantly. The director blinked. What? No. Kat smiled politely. Thank you for thinking of me. A pause. No. The director looked genuinely confused. People often were when told no, especially administrators. You haven't even heard the proposal. I've heard enough. The director stared. Kat folded her arms. This ends with extra meetings. A pause, public speaking. Another, PowerPoint presentations. Another, and paperwork. The horror in her voice was completely genuine. The director actually laughed. There's some paperwork. See, Kat pointed. That's how it starts. The meeting lasted another 20 minutes, 20 very frustrating minutes. By the end of them, Kat had rejected the proposal 6 separate times. The director had ignored every rejection, which unfortunately suggested years of administrative experience. When the meeting finally ended, Kat escaped into the hallway, only to discover Brenda waiting outside. The older nurse took one look at her face. "Oh, a pause, they got you," Kat pointed accusingly. "You knew?" Brenda smiled. "I absolutely knew." The betrayal hurt deeply. 2 days later, Richard arrived for a follow-up appointment. The moment he entered the VA, he noticed something unusual. People were smiling at Kat, more than usual, nurses, doctors, staff, even administrators. This concerned him immediately. Because nobody smiled that much in hospitals unless trouble was involved. He found her sitting at the nurse's station staring at a stack of forms. The expression on her face suggested she was contemplating arson. Richard sat down. "What's wrong?" Kat pointed toward the paperwork. "They're trying to promote me." The old Marine blinked, then laughed hard. Kat looked offended. "This isn't funny." "It absolutely is." The nurse narrowed her eyes. "I could leave." "No." Richard immediately stopped laughing. "Don't do that." Kat looked suspicious. "Why?" The answer surprised him because it appeared before he had time to think about it. "Because people need you." Silence. The words hung in the air, unexpected, honest. Kat looked away first because compliments made her uncomfortable. Always had, Richard noticed, which made him smile. The woman who could sprint through gunfire, the woman who could run cardiac arrests, the woman who could handle angry veterans couldn't handle being appreciated. Human beings were strange. Over the next month, something remarkable happened. The outreach program started anyway, despite her objections, despite her complaints. Despite her increasingly creative attempts to avoid involvement, veterans began requesting appointments, not medical appointments, conversations, coffee meetings, peer support sessions, informal gatherings. At first there were 5 people, then 10, then 20, then more. Word spread not through advertisements, not through hospital marketing, through veterans. The fastest communication network on Earth. One veteran told another, who told another, who told another. Stories traveled, people listened. Eventually, the small support group outgrew the conference room, then outgrew a larger room, then required its own dedicated space. One afternoon, Kat walked into a meeting and stopped. Completely stopped. The room was full, standing room only. Vietnam veterans, Iraq veterans, Afghanistan veterans, Navy, Army, Marine Corps, Air Force, Coast Guard, different generations, different experiences, same struggles. For several seconds she simply stared, then looked toward Brenda. "What is this?" Brenda smiled. "This." A pause. "This is your fault." The meeting began. Stories were shared, advice exchanged, jokes told, coffee consumed in dangerous quantities. Halfway through the session, Kat noticed Richard standing near the back wall, listening, watching, smiling, not the old smile, not the bitter one, the new one, the healthy one. Afterward he approached quietly. "You know something?" Kat sighed. "What?" Richard looked around the room, at the conversations, the laughter, the friendships forming, the connections growing, then back at her. "You saved more people here than you ever did overseas." The statement hit her like a punch. Immediately, because part of her still measured life through deployments, through casualties, through emergencies, through dramatic moments. Richard shook his head. "You think saving people only counts when someone's bleeding." A pause. "It doesn't." Kat looked around the room again, really looked, at veterans helping veterans. At isolated people reconnecting, at men and women finding community again, at healing, real healing, not dramatic, not cinematic, not fast, the kind that happened one conversation at a time. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Richard smiled. "You know what's funny?" Kat groaned. "What?" The old Marine folded his arms. "You spent years trying to figure out why you survived." Silence. "Maybe this is why." For once, Catherine Bennett didn't have an argument. And standing in a room filled with veterans who were no longer carrying their burdens alone, she realized something she should have understood years earlier. The purpose of survival wasn't to justify the past, it was to help build the future, and for the first time since Afghanistan. That future looked bright, which unfortunately was exactly when life decided to test it. 6 months passed, not quickly, not slowly, the way real life passes, one ordinary day after another. Richard continued physical therapy, continued attending veteran support meetings, continued showing up for coffee sessions he pretended not to enjoy. The outreach program expanded. Veterans from neighboring counties started attending. Families began participating. Spouses joined discussions. Adult children asked questions they'd been afraid to ask for years. Something meaningful was growing, something nobody had planned. Something nobody could have created through paperwork alone, and Catherine Bennett remained right in the middle of it, complaining constantly, helping everyone anyway. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Kat sat in her office reviewing notes from a support session. Murphy slept beside her desk. The dog had somehow convinced the entire hospital staff that he belonged there. Nobody knew how, not even Kat. At some point, he had simply become part of the outreach program. Veterans adored him. Children adored him. The staff adored him. The dog contributed absolutely nothing and received universal praise. Kat found this deeply unfair. Her phone rang. The number looked unfamiliar. Normally, she ignored unfamiliar numbers. Experience had taught her that unfamiliar numbers usually represented problems. Today she answered, a decision she would later question. Catherine Bennett, the voice sounded male, older, professional. Yes. A pause followed. My name is Michael Miller. The surname immediately caught her attention, not because Miller was uncommon, because some names never stop meaning something. The voice continued. I'm Danny's father. Everything stopped, the office, the paperwork, the rain outside, even her breathing. For several seconds she couldn't respond. Danny Miller, 14 years later, and the name still carried weight, still carried emotion, still carried memory. Murphy lifted his head, sensing the change immediately. Dogs always noticed. I hope this isn't inappropriate. Michael's voice sounded nervous now. I got your number from Richard. A pause. He told me about the outreach program. Another. And he told me about you. Kat closed her eyes slowly because she already knew where this conversation was heading, or thought she did. She was wrong. My wife and I are coming to town next week. Michael cleared his throat. We were wondering if you'd have dinner with us. Silence, not because the request was unreasonable, because it wasn't. It was kind, generous, thoughtful, which somehow made it harder. For years she carried Danny's memory, mourned him, remembered him, honored him. But she'd never met his parents, never spoken to them, never known what happened afterward. The idea suddenly terrified her. Michael seemed to sense it. You don't have to. A pause. Richard said you might say no. Kat almost laughed. That sounded exactly like Richard. Then Michael added something unexpected. We just wanted to thank you. The words hit harder than they should have, immediately, because gratitude was complicated, especially when it involved people you couldn't save. Her voice softened. Mr. Miller, Michael, Kat swallowed, your son, we know. The interruption came gently, not harshly, not angrily. We know what happened. Silence, and we know what you tried to do. The office became very quiet. For years she'd carried memories of that day, the firefight, the evacuation, the impossible injuries, the desperate effort. All the things combat medics remember, the things they replay, the things they second-guess, the things they wish they could change. Michael spoke again. Richard told us the whole story. A pause. He said our son wasn't alone. Kat looked down, unable to answer. Because suddenly her eyes were burning and she hated crying, especially during office hours. Murphy immediately stood up, walked over, placed his head on her knee. The traitor. The conversation lasted almost an hour. By the end of it, dinner plans were arranged, addresses exchanged, promises made. After hanging up, Kat remained sitting quietly, thinking, remembering, healing. A week later, she found herself standing outside a small restaurant wondering why her hands were shaking. Across the parking lot, Richard looked entirely too amused. You fought in Afghanistan. Kat glared. Don't. You ran toward machine gun fire. Richard, and dinner makes you nervous. The old Marine smiled, a very annoying smile. Then a car pulled into the parking lot. Everything changed. A man stepped out first. Mid-60s, gray hair, kind eyes, Danny's eyes. The resemblance hit instantly. Then a woman emerged from the passenger side, holding a photograph. Kat's breath caught, because she already knew which photograph it was. The famous one, Danny smiling beside his platoon. The photograph Richard carried. For a moment nobody moved. Then Michael Miller walked forward, stopped, and quietly said the words Catherine Bennett never expected to hear. Thank you for bringing part of our son home. The tears came immediately, no stopping them, no hiding them, because some wounds don't heal through time, they heal through people. Richard looked away, giving them privacy. giving them dignity because he understood something now that he'd spent 14 years learning. The dead never truly leave. They remain in stories, in memories, in families, in friendships, in the lives they touched, and sometimes, if you're lucky, they help strangers find each other years later. As the four of them entered the restaurant together, Richard felt a quiet sense of gratitude settle over him, not for the war, never for the war, but for what came afterward, the healing, the friendship, the second chances. The opportunity to keep living. For years he believed survival created a debt. Now he finally understood the truth. Survival created responsibility, not to suffer, not to punish yourself, not to carry guilt forever, to live well, to remember kindly, and to help the people still walking beside you. Looking through the restaurant window, Richard watched Catherine laughing with Danny Miller's parents, really laughing, the kind of laugh that comes from the heart, the kind untouched by grief, the kind earned through healing, and for the first time since Afghanistan, Commander Richard Sterling felt completely at peace. Richard felt completely at peace. The feeling surprised him, not because peace was impossible, because it had been absent for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like. For years he'd assumed peace was something dramatic, a moment of revelation, a breakthrough, a finish line waiting somewhere in the distance. Instead, it arrived quietly, in a restaurant, over dinner, listening to stories about a young Marine who never got the chance to grow old. Michael Miller turned out to be nothing like Richard expected. Danny's father laughed often, talked constantly, and possessed the same stubborn refusal to let serious conversations stay serious for very long. Halfway through dinner, he pulled out an old family photo album. Kat immediately groaned. Richard immediately became interested. Those two reactions told Michael everything he needed to know. "Good," he said. "You're already acting like family." Kat nearly choked on her drink. The older man smiled, then opened the album. Page after page revealed Danny's life before the military. Little league games, school pictures, fishing trips, birthdays, graduation, ordinary moments. The sort of moments combat veterans rarely get to see, because they usually meet people near the end of their stories, not the beginning. Kat stared at the photographs, absorbing them, trying to connect the teenager in the pictures with the young Marine she'd known overseas. Somehow both versions existed simultaneously. The goofy kid, the brave Marine, the son, the friend, the loss, the memory. By the time dinner ended, nobody wanted to leave, not because the conversation was extraordinary, because it felt normal, and normal was precious, very precious. For people who'd spent years carrying grief, normal moments often meant more than dramatic ones. Outside the restaurant, Michael shook Richard's hand, then pulled him into a hug. The old Marine looked startled, then embarrassed, then emotional. In that exact order. Kat pretended not to notice, mostly because she knew he'd never forgive her if she did. Driving home later, Richard stared out the passenger window. The city lights blurred past. The silence felt comfortable. Finally he spoke. "You know something?" Kat smiled. That phrase usually means trouble. Richard ignored her. "I spent 14 years thinking about Danny's death." A pause. "Tonight was the first time I spent more time thinking about his life." The words settled inside the car, heavy, important, true. Kat didn't answer immediately, because some statements don't need responses, they need space. Eventually she nodded. "That's how it's supposed to work." Richard looked out the window again, and for once the memories that followed weren't painful. They were warm. That realization alone felt miraculous. Over the following months, the outreach program continued growing. Veterans arrived from neighboring counties, then neighboring states. Stories spread, lives changed, not dramatically, not overnight, slowly. The way real healing always happens. One conversation, one friendship, one difficult day survived at a time. And somewhere along the way, Catherine Bennett stopped thinking of herself as a former corpsman who happened to be a nurse. She became something else, something larger, a bridge between past and future, between service and civilian life, between isolation and community. She never asked for the role, never wanted the attention. But sometimes purpose finds people whether they want it or not, and Catherine Bennett was finally beginning to accept hers. Richard was finally beginning to accept it. The funny thing about purpose was that it rarely arrived the way people expected. Most people imagined purpose as a destination, a moment, a calling, something dramatic. In reality, purpose often looked like showing up repeatedly, on ordinary Tuesdays, during bad weather, when you were tired, when nobody applauded. When nobody noticed, that was what Catherine Bennett had been doing for years. She simply hadn't recognized it. The realization arrived one autumn afternoon. The outreach center was crowded, every chair occupied. Veterans lined the walls, coffee cups covered tables, conversations filled the room. The atmosphere felt alive, not loud. Not chaotic, alive. Kat stood near the back reviewing schedules when she noticed something unusual. A young man sat alone near the entrance. Maybe 24, 25, clean haircut, military posture, nervous eyes. He hadn't touched his coffee, hadn't joined a conversation, hadn't spoken to anyone. He simply sat there, watching. Evaluating, trying to decide whether he belonged. Kat recognized the look immediately because she'd worn it once. Richard noticed him too. The old Marine followed her gaze, then smiled, a small knowing smile. "You got a new one," Kat sighed. "Don't call them that." "What new ones?" Richard shrugged. "You know what I mean." Unfortunately, she did. Veterans always recognized recently separated service members. There was a look, a posture, a distance in their eyes, the awkward feeling of existing between two worlds. No longer military, not quite civilian, lost somewhere in between. The hardest place to be. The young man finally stood, then sat back down, then stood again, then changed his mind. Richard laughed quietly. "He reminds me of you." Kat looked horrified. "I was not that awkward." The old Marine stared for several seconds. "Kat, what?" "You absolutely were." She hated that he was right, mostly because he was. Eventually she walked over. The young veteran immediately looked nervous, as though he'd been caught doing something wrong. "Hi," the man nodded. "Hi, I'm Kat." Recognition flashed across his face immediately, which was becoming increasingly common and increasingly uncomfortable. "Oh," a pause. "You're Kat." She already hated where this was going. The veteran rubbed the back of his neck. "I almost didn't come." Kat smiled. "Most people almost don't." That earned the first tiny smile, barely visible. But there, the young man looked around the room, at the conversations, at the veterans, at the community he'd spent 20 minutes observing, then back at her. "I don't really know how this works." The honesty surprised her, not because it was unusual, because it was brave. People underestimated how much courage honesty required, especially after military service, especially for people struggling. Kat pulled out a chair and sat down. "No one knows how it works." The veteran frowned. "What?" She smiled. "We're all making it up." For a second he looked confused. Then he laughed, a short, unexpected laugh. The first genuine emotion she'd seen from him. Good, that was a start. Across the room Richard watched the interaction quietly. A younger version of himself would have missed the significance. The older version understood perfectly. This was how it happened, not through speeches. Not through programs, not through hospital initiatives. One conversation, then another, until somebody who felt alone realized they weren't. The young veteran stayed for the entire session, then returned the following week, and the week after that, and the week after that. A few months later he was helping newcomers find seats. 6 months later he was mentoring recently separated veterans himself. The cycle continued, just as it always had. One person helping another, then paying it forward, the simplest system in the world and somehow the most powerful. One evening after a particularly busy session, Richard and Kat remained behind helping stack chairs. The room was finally empty, coffee cups discarded, lights dimmed, the day's conversations fading into memory. Richard looked around, at the chairs, the walls, the photographs veterans had donated over the years. The place felt different now, permanent, important, real. Then he looked toward Kat. "You know what this reminds me of?" She groaned. "Why do all your questions sound dangerous?" Richard ignored her. "This reminds me of a unit." Kat paused because she understood exactly what he meant. Not military structure, not rank, not hierarchy, family, community, belonging, the feeling that someone would notice if you disappeared, the feeling that someone cared whether you made it home. For years, veterans had searched for that feeling after service. Now somehow they were rebuilding it, together. Kat sat down in one of the remaining chairs, suddenly tired, tired, the kind that comes after meaningful work. Richard sat beside her. Neither spoke for a while. Outside, evening settled across the city. Inside, the outreach center sat quiet for the first time all day. Finally, Richard smiled. A real smile, the peaceful kind. I think Danny would have liked this place. Kat looked toward the photographs hanging on the wall, toward the countless stories represented there, toward the lives still moving forward. Then she smiled too. Yeah, a pause. He would have talked way too much. Richard laughed so much. For several moments they simply sat there, two veterans, two survivors, two friends, watching the future continue growing around them, and neither realized it yet, but the next chapter of their story would be the last one. The final act wasn't about war, loss, or healing. It was about legacy. Richard smiled, a real smile, the peaceful kind. I think Danny would have liked this place. Kat looked toward the photographs hanging on the wall, toward the countless stories represented there, toward the lives still moving forward. Then she smiled too. Yeah, a pause. He would have talked way too much. Richard laughed so much. For several moments they simply sat there in the quiet outreach center, two veterans, two survivors, two friends, watching the future continue growing around them. Neither realized it yet, but the next chapter of their story would be the last one. Not because life was ending, because a chapter was, and some chapters deserve proper endings. The following spring, the VA announced an annual veteran recognition ceremony. Kat hated the idea immediately. Not because she disliked veterans, because she disliked attention. There was an important difference. Unfortunately, nobody cared about that distinction. 3 separate administrators called her. Brenda cornered her twice. Richard became suspiciously supportive, which meant he was absolutely involved somehow. Whenever Richard acted supportive, trouble usually followed. Years of experience had confirmed this. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Kat discovered the truth. She entered the outreach center carrying coffee and immediately noticed people acting strange. Conversations stopped when she walked in. Smiles appeared. Several veterans suddenly found the floor fascinating. The behavior was so obvious it would have been insulting if it wasn't so ridiculous. Kat narrowed her eyes. What did you do? Richard looked offended. Why is that always your first question? Because you're involved. The old Marine opened his mouth, closed it, then sighed. Fair. The room immediately started laughing, which confirmed everything. Kat pointed around the room. Whatever is happening, I don't like it. Nobody looked remotely concerned. That worried her. A lot. The ceremony arrived 3 weeks later. The auditorium was packed. Veterans, families, hospital staff, community leaders, volunteers. The outreach program had grown so much that people now traveled from several counties away to attend events. Kat still found that difficult to believe. She sat near the back, hoping to remain unnoticed. The plan failed immediately. Half the audience already knew who she was. The other half learned quickly. Richard sat 2 rows away pretending to be innocent. The act was unconvincing, very unconvincing. The hospital director eventually stepped onto the stage. The audience quieted. Awards were presented. Volunteers recognized. Stories shared. Several speeches ran longer than necessary, as tradition demanded. Then the director cleared his throat, looked down at his notes, and smiled. Kat immediately felt nervous. That smile again, the administrator smile, the dangerous one. Before we conclude tonight, there's one final recognition. The audience remained quiet. The director looked toward the crowd, then directly at Kat. And everything suddenly made sense. Oh no, the words escaped before she could stop them. Richard immediately started laughing. The traitor, the absolute traitor, the director continued. For years, veterans arriving at our hospital often carried more than physical injuries. The room became silent. They carried grief. A pause, isolation, another, anger, another, and the belief that nobody understood. Kat stared at the floor, already miserable. The audience listened, completely focused. The director looked toward the veterans seated throughout the room. One nurse changed that. Kat wanted to disappear immediately. Preferably through the floor. The speech continued anyway. Stories followed, testimonials, experiences, lives impacted. Veterans stood one after another, sharing memories, sharing gratitude, sharing moments she didn't even remember. A Vietnam veteran spoke about reconnecting with his family. A young Marine described finding purpose after separation from service. A widow spoke about finally understanding her husband's struggles. The stories continued, one after another, and with each story, Kat felt increasingly uncomfortable. not because she disagreed, because she never saw herself the way they did. To her, she was just doing her job, showing up, listening. Helping where she could, nothing extraordinary. Apparently everyone else disagreed. Then Richard stood, the room immediately quieted. The old Marine walked slowly toward the stage. No walker, no assistants, strong, healthy, alive. The audience watched, Kat watched. Richard stopped at the podium, looked around the room. Then found her in the crowd. For a moment he said nothing. Then, when I arrived at the VA, I was angry. A few people laughed. The understatement was impressive. Richard smiled. I blamed everyone. A pause, the nurses, another, the doctors, another, myself. The room grew quieter because now they understood where this was going. I spent 14 years carrying ghosts. His voice remained steady, calm, honest. I thought honoring the dead meant suffering. Silence filled the auditorium. I thought guilt was loyalty. Another silence. Turns out I was wrong. Richard looked toward Kat again. The entire audience followed his gaze. Then he smiled, the peaceful smile, the healthy one. The best corpsman I ever knew taught me something. Kat immediately shook her head. No, absolutely not. Too late. Richard ignored her, as always. She taught me that survival isn't a debt. The room was completely silent now. No movement, no distractions, just listening. Survival is an opportunity. A pause, an opportunity to help the people still here. Another, an opportunity to remember kindly. Another, an opportunity to keep living. The old Marine looked around the auditorium, at the veterans, the families, the friends, the future, then back at Kat. For 14 years I thought I lost a war. His smile widened. Turns out I just hadn't finished healing yet. Many people in the audience were crying now, Kat included, though she'd deny it later, repeatedly and unsuccessfully. Richard stepped away from the podium. The audience rose to its feet, not some of them, all of them, a standing ovation. Long, loud, earned. Kat covered her face with one hand. Completely overwhelmed, completely embarrassed, completely loved. And as the applause filled the room, she finally understood something that had taken years to learn. Legacy isn't built through dramatic moments. It isn't built through medals or recognition or stories people tell after you're gone. Legacy is built one person at a time, one conversation, one act of kindness, one life improved because you were there. And looking around the room at the people whose lives had become connected through friendship, healing, and hope, Catherine Bennett realized she already had the legacy she'd spent years searching for. She just hadn't recognized it until now.